jungle base. The base was an old Marley outpost, half swallowed by a humid jungle, its watchtowers wrapped in vines, and its corrugated roofs hissing under midnight rain that never quite ended. They had taken shelter after a long recon, stringing cots in a central barracks room and posting rotating watches, while the generator muttered and insects sang like 1,000 clocks disagreeing with one another. Eren slept closest to the door, restless even in dreams. Mikasa kept her scarf within reach. Armin had a notebook under his pillow. Levi never truly slept, only measured darkness with his eyes half-lidded. Hange snored lightly beside a satchel of vials. Reiner lay with his boots pointed at the exit. Erwin rested upright by the wall. Historia, exhausted and oddly quiet that night, took the cot near the shuttered window. Connie mumbled something about the generator and drifted off last. At dawn, the rain thinned to a silver mist, and someone screamed. Historia lay cold, her skin pale and damp, eyes half open toward the ceiling beams, a faint violet line on the side of her neck, like a kiss that had learned cruelty. For a long second, no one moved. Then Levi was there first, fingers to her throat, then to her wrist, then drawing back as if the air had cut him. And he said nothing because there was nothing left to say. The locked room. Erwin's voice came calm through the throb of shock, steadying the air like a hand on the table in a storm. Doors were barred from the inside, he said, glancing at the timber braces Hange had rigged before lights out, and the window's interior latch still sat down, unbroken, with condensation beaded like sweat along the edges. If this was a murder, the killer either never left or never entered, Armin said, gaze sweeping the floorboards, the sill, the cot sheets, and the damp trail no one had made yet. Mikasa moved to Eren's side without looking, the motion automatic as breath, her eyes already taking stock of hands, boots, blades, and distances between people who suddenly felt farther apart than a room allowed. Reiner stood very still at the foot of his cot, as if motion might make the accusation inside the silence point at him by default, and Connie rubbed his neck and stared at the floor like it might tell him what to think. Hange knelt by Historia and leaned close without touching, nostrils flaring once, then pulling a vial from her satchel with a softness that sounded like grief. "I smell bitter almond," Hange murmured, and Armin's eyes flicked to her with a question he didn't need to voice. "Cyanogenic compounds," Hange said, voice low and clinical, "but there's also a puncture, here very fine, subdermal, consistent with a dart or needle," and Levi's jaw tightened as if he'd bitten a wire. "Windows," Levi said, and Eren and Mikasa moved to them in the same second, testing latches, lighting shutters, checking for stress on the inner bar, finding only the fine powder of jungle dust, disturbed in a crescent no one had made walking. Erwin gestured to the braces they had set across the main door. 2 oak beams lifted into iron brackets before lights out, something only a group together could unseat without noise. "If a killer didn't come from outside, they were with us all night," Erwin said, and a hush like static settled, the kind that comes before people start speaking carefully and too late. "No," Armin said, kneeling by the window, touching a line of moisture where it shouldn't be in the morning's airflow, and he pointed to a faint scrape on the sash, only visible when the light hit wrong. Levi crouched, eyes narrowing, and plucked a tiny fiber from the sill, pale and stiff, not cotton, not hemp. "Wire silk from a modified line," he said, pocketing it, sold in the underground 5 years back to anti-personnel types who liked quiet entries. And Hange nodded once, anger sharpening and cooling at the same time. So someone outside reached in, Eren said, fists tight, and his voice sounded like the edge of a new plan he did not yet have. Alibis and friction. Account for your hours, Erwin said, not unkindly, and they began to speak around the ache. Eren said he woke up twice at thunder. One said a dream he couldn't remember, and had seen Mikasa awake beside him and Levi's silhouette by the far wall at least once, and nothing else because sleep had taken him like a blunt instrument. Mikasa said she heard the generator cough around second watch and saw Connie slip out to check it with a wrench and a curse, then return in 5 minutes, smelling of fuel and apology, after which she dozed until dawn and woke to air colder than it should have been. Connie swallowed and nodded, cheeks flushed, voice small but steady, as he said the engine had starved on a clogged filter, and he'd knocked the grid loose, no more no less, and Hange nodded to confirm the generator's rhythm had improved after the cough. Reiner said nothing at first. Then I slept, and it was true enough to pass for a lie because it had no edges, and Levi's eyes flicked to the bandage on Reiner's palm, from a palm frond cut the day before, fresh enough to itch and bleed if clenched. Armin said he wrote notes until his eyes blurred, then drifted, then woke to a single drip somewhere that didn't belong, and counted to 100 like he used to, when fear had to be taught to wait, then slept again until the scream. Who argued with Historia? Levi asked, flat, because grief has to stand somewhere, and questions build floors. No one spoke for a heartbeat. Then Eren said, I did, without flinching. She said we should turn back, that this outpost was wrong for us, that Erwin was pushing too hard on thin intel, and I said we don't get to be careful anymore, and the silence after it was clean and hard. Erwin's mouth moved like a line he would not deliver, and Hange checked her vial again, as if science might give her something gentler to do than listen. Levi knelt by the cot leg and rubbed 2 fingers together, eyes thin with focus. He said, there's grit here different from the floor dust, river sand fine, carried in on boots, and he stood staring at their soles, one by one, finding the faint gray smear on only one heel, Reiner's, then on Connie's lace, and on Levi's own tread from an earlier patrol. The riverbank's the only place with sand that fine within 100 meters, Armin said, by the east wall, and Reiner said, I went to piss, flat as iron, and Connie said, I tripped the drum there when I checked the water line yesterday, and the room weighed both statements and did not like the taste of either. The first clues. Hange's reagent turned a handkerchief faint blue, where she dabbed at the puncture site on Historia's neck, and she exhaled through her nose like a kettle finishing a song. She said, protein fixer shows binding, curare-like compound carried with a cyanogenic agent. Dart delivered paralysis, then the rest stopped the heart, and Mikasa looked away just enough to hide the flinch, and Eren stared until the world stared back. Are you certain of the method? Erwin asked, and Hange nodded once, as if certainty was a coat she hated but needed. Armin traced the window latch with a length of thread and a small weight from his jacket pocket, looping it to show how it could be raised and dropped from outside with patience and a steady hand through the slats. He said, the moisture pattern and the latch position match a late-night open and reset, and the scrape shows someone who practiced enough to be sloppy once, and Levi's eyes sharpened in approval, without softening. Then the killer is not one of us, Mikasa said, relief and anger braided tight, and they're still out there, and the room breathed again, but only a little. Erwin inclined his head, gaze going distant and exact like a compass needing blood to point. He said, they will strike again, either for the leader, the commander, or the mind that can prove them wrong, and his eyes moved to himself. to Levi, to Armin, and then to Eren because fate hates being left out of lists. Levi said, "We set a trap," already moving, voice barreling over sorrow, because action is the only funeral he gives. We let them choose their target and catch their hands before they finish the gesture, and Hange's nod said she'd already chosen her tools. The trap. They rearranged the cots, moving Erwin's to the window and building his shape beneath blankets, while Erwin himself sat 3 feet to the left in shadow, a posture of patience and teeth. Armin's pillow went to the far wall, where a coat and a book laid in a careful suggestion of sleeping breath, while Armin crouched under a table with a mirror shard angled toward the shutters. Levi strung a hair-thin tripline of wire silk at knee height in front of the sill and dusted the floor beyond with powdered chalk Hange swore would show a ghost's footprints if mixed right, and Mikasa took the rafters, silent as a held thought. Coin killed the generator at Levi's nod, and darkness took the room in a clean bite, replacing electric hum with insect saw and the far-off rush of water hunting rocks. Reiner posted himself by the door brace, hands loose, face unreadable, the picture of a man daring a wall to say it could stop him. And Eren stood 2 paces behind Levi, like a fuse that had agreed to learn patience tonight, and only tonight. Time lengthened the way it does when waiting is work, and Hange counted heartbeats under her breath, and Erwin didn't move enough to register as human to a careless eye. The window slats sighed once, then again, and exhaled too gentle for wind, and Armin's mirror caught a thread of darker dark, a line sliding in, weight on silk, hands where hands shouldn't be, a whisper of metal, the near silent hush of a dart tube brought to lips, and Levi moved at the same heartbeat the wire silk thrummed, his boot taking the line while his hand flashed and the shutter jerked open as Mikasa dropped from the beam like a shadow acquiring mass. A figure in a damp cloak straddled the sill with 1 foot in and 1 foot out, one hand on a line and the other lifting the tube, but the line snapped tight across his calf and he pitched forward into Reiner's chest, which did not move except to close arms like a trap. The man's free hand went for his mouth with that practiced speed that means the end is in the teeth, but Eren's fingers clamped his wrist and twisted with a white-hot control he had learned the hard way, and the capsule fell and skittered into Hange's waiting cloth like a beetle losing an argument. "Alive," Levi said, blade at the throat, voice low as a promise, and Reiner loosened to hear but not an inch more, and Mikasa's foot pinned the man's dart hand to the floor with a pressure that explained everything about mercy and why she uses it sparingly. The signal house. The jungle swallowed sound, turning their footfalls into rumors, and the river's hiss grew from a thread to a sheet to a wall as they followed its edge to a squat stone shed on a rise like a knuckle. A shuttered window faced downriver, a metal hood above it for rain, and inside a lantern sat on a tripod with a stack of shutters that could make words for anyone who spoke the code and cared to listen when they shouldn't. The floorboards were warped, but not enough to hide. Levi pried up the 3rd plank by the wall with the blade and found a small ledger bound in waxed cloth. The pages neat with numbers and broken into blocks that look like money until you realize they bought messages and not bread. Armin flipped through and found the page with tonight's date already half written, the sequence for target neutralized, and a follow-up code for secondary objectives commenced. And he exhaled once like a diver seeing bottom and deciding he didn't like it. "We send a message back," he said, "something that buys us time and misdirects. and Eren looked at him with that fierce trust he reserved for the moments when plans and pain shook hands. Levi watched the tree line as Armin worked the shutters, signaling compromised weather and delay, while Mikasa marked tracks outside, one set to the east, one to the north, one so faint it might have been a wish. The second attempt. They returned to the base under a sky that looked like it might choose thunder again if given a good reason, and Erwin met them at the door with a nod that said both, "Go on," and "I already know the half I need." Hange stood over a tray of extracts, one vial now labeled in tight letters, Arrow Night Derivative, and another, Bitter Seed Oil, her eyes tired and clear and angry in the right order. "He carried 2 darts," she said, pointing at the tube's residue. "One used, one intended." And Armin lifted the capsule they'd taken from the floor, as if it were a word you needed to say slowly to survive. From the rafters came a soft scrape, too light for a rat, too deliberate for wind, and Mikasa's blade was in her hand before the thought finished forming. A second figure slid from a beam near the far wall, rope burned and frayed, knife between fingers like a shared secret, and the edge flashed once toward Armin's shadows. Levi's throw hit the wrist bone with a dull crack, and the knife sang a short, wrong note on the floor. And Eren's shoulder met ribs, and the 2 bodies went down with a crash that topped the room in new shape for a second. "Pair attack," Erwin said, as if cataloging it for a future no one wanted, and Hange was already there with a cloth that took the second man's weapon and breath in 2 motions. "Name," Levi said, and the man laughed blood into his teeth and said, "You already knew we were 2, and then bit his lip and swallowed, and Hange swore, because some capsules do not need hands to reach mouths. They wanted the ledger in the signal house discovered, and this one to confirm the kill, and if we hadn't set a trap, one of us would be on the floor now." And Mikasa's eyes moved to Eren with the softness of steel, remembering why it was forged. The reveal. Levi stood by Historia's cot as the afternoon became a deeper color of grief, his hands empty and still. They chose poison and distance because they did not want to be remembered by the person they killed. Cowards with codes and lines and mouths full of orders, and his eyes were knives he didn't have to draw. Erwin folded the signal ledger closed and set it beside the bound assassin like a ledger finally balanced by something other than numbers. "We have senders upstream and receivers in Trost, and the messages they wanted will not arrive." And he looked to Hange, who nodded once, to Armin, who had already written 3 plans, and to Levi, who had none and needed none to know the next steps. "We will carry Historia home," Mikasa said, voice steady, choosing a verb that made the room breathe again. And Eren swallowed and said, "We will find who ordered this." And his tone promised the kind of truth that doesn't need a tribunal. Reiner set his jaw and put a hand on the assassin's chair back with a gentleness that would have confused any god not paying attention. And Connie looked at the floor and then at the window and then back again, like he was teaching himself where to stand in a world that had moved. Resolution. Night returned, clean and black, and they kept watch in shifts as if sleep were an indulgence. intelligence for another unit in another story, and the jungle agreed to keep their secrets for one more turn of the earth. By dawn, the bound assassin had confessed enough to prove the shape of the conspiracy, and not enough to save himself from whatever came next. And Erwin wrote a dispatch in a hand that did not shake, and sealed it with a strip of oilcloth and intention. Hange cleaned her vials. Armin closed his notebook. Mikasa folded a blanket that smelled faintly of rain and lilies. And Levi sat on a crate outside the door with a blade and a rag, wiping a spot that wasn't there anymore. They lifted Historia together, step by step, and the base watched them leave with the silence of an accomplice who has finally learned a lesson too late to be useful. The river's hiss softened as they crossed the rise, and the path turned from mud to stone to road, and the jungle let them go without apology and without blessing, which is the best you can ask of a place that keeps books you cannot read. Behind them, the signal house lantern stayed dark, and up ahead, the world opened